The locomotive hissed to a stop at the Cedar Valley station on a morning so bright it seemed to mock the gray uniforms stepping down onto the platform. Colonel Friedrich von Steinbach squinted against the Iowa sun, one hand shielding his eyes, the other gripping a leather valise that had traveled across an ocean and half a continent. Behind him, 3 other officers emerged: Captain Ernst Müller, Lieutenant Hans Weber, and Major Klaus Reinhardt, each carrying the bearing of men who had commanded respect on different soil, in a different life. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The year was 1948. The war had ended 3 years prior, but its echoes still reverberated through every conversation, every glance exchanged between victor and vanquished. The German officers were not prisoners, not exactly. They were part of an agricultural exchange program, an experiment in reconciliation designed by bureaucrats in Washington who believed that understanding could be cultivated like crops in good soil. The officers had been selected for their pre-war expertise in agriculture and estate management. Men who had once overseen vast European holdings, now sent to learn from American methods. Thomas Brennan stood at the edge of the platform, his flannel shirt rolled to the elbows despite the autumn chill that would settle by evening. He was 42, broad-shouldered, with hands that told the story of every harvest, every fence post driven into stubborn earth. His face was weathered but kind, creased around the eyes from squinting into too many sunrises. When the county agricultural office had asked if he'd host the German delegation for 2 months, his wife Margaret had hesitated only a moment before nodding. "They're somebody's sons," she'd said quietly. "And the war is over." Thomas stepped forward, extending his hand. Von Steinbach looked at it for a long moment. Long enough that the silence became uncomfortable, long enough that Thomas could see the colonel measuring him, evaluating, perhaps remembering other American hands that had held weapons instead of welcomes. Then von Steinbach grasped it firmly. "Mr. Brennan," he said, his English precise but heavily accented, "we are grateful for your hospitality." "Welcome to Cedar Valley," Thomas replied. "Let's get you settled. It's a 20-minute drive to the farm." The officers loaded their minimal luggage into Thomas's Ford pickup truck, a vehicle that immediately caught their attention. It was only 3 years old, clean, well-maintained. Müller ran his hand along the hood, exchanging a glance with Weber that Thomas pretended not to notice. In their world, in the Europe they'd left behind, a farmer driving a relatively new automobile was an anomaly worth noting. The road from town curved through landscape that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. Fields of harvested corn reduced to golden stubble, silos rising like sentinels, farmhouses set back from the road with long driveways lined by trees that blazed orange and crimson. Von Steinbach sat in the passenger seat, his gaze fixed on the passing scenery with an intensity that suggested he was cataloging every detail. "Your roads are very good," he observed. "Paved, even here in the countryside. County maintains them," Thomas said. "Farmers need to get their goods to market. Can't do that if you're stuck in mud half the year." In the truck bed, the other 3 officers sat on benches Thomas had installed, their uniforms, worn at American insistence to distinguish them from locals, drawing stares from passing vehicles. A woman in a Chevrolet slowed as she passed, her expression unreadable. A man in overalls raised 2 fingers from his steering wheel in the universal rural greeting, though his jaw was tight. The Brennan farm appeared as they crested a gentle hill, 320 acres of prime Iowa farmland, with a white 2-story house, a large red barn, 2 equipment sheds, a chicken coop, and a windmill that turned lazily in the breeze. Dairy cows grazed in a pasture to the east. A vegetable garden, now mostly harvested, stretched behind the house. A yellow school bus was just pulling away from the end of the driveway. Margaret Brennan stood on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, her brown hair pulled back in a practical bun. Beside her were their 3 children: Robert, 15, tall and serious; Sarah, 12, curious-eyed; and little James, 8, who clutched his mother's skirt with one hand while peering at the strangers with undisguised fascination. As the officers climbed out of the truck, Margaret descended the porch steps. She'd rehearsed this moment in her mind, wondering what she'd feel facing men who had fought for the regime that had caused so much suffering. But looking at them now, dusty, uncertain, far from home, she felt only a firm resolve to extend the grace she hoped someone would show her sons if circumstances were ever reversed. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice steady. "Supper's at 6. We eat what we grow, mostly. I hope you're not particular about simple food." "Madam," von Steinbach said, removing his cap, "we have learned not to be particular about anything." That first evening set a pattern that would repeat with variations over the following weeks. The officers were given the guest rooms upstairs, 2 to a room, which they accepted without complaint, though Thomas noticed them exchanging glances at the indoor plumbing, the electric lights, the radiators that heated each space. Supper was pork chops from their own hogs, potatoes, green beans Margaret had canned in summer, fresh bread, apple pie with cream from their dairy cows. The officers ate with quiet intensity, and Thomas saw Major Reinhardt close his eyes after the first bite of pie, a flicker of something, memory perhaps or loss, crossing his face. "Your wife is an excellent cook," von Steinbach said. "She is," Thomas agreed. "But you should know, this isn't a special meal because you're here. This is how we eat most nights." He watched that information settle over them, saw Mueller's fork pause halfway to his mouth, saw Weber glance around the dining room as if reassessing everything, the china cabinet with its good dishes, the electric clock on the wall, the telephone on the small table in the hallway, the radio in the living room visible through the doorway. After dinner, Thomas led them on a tour of the property in the fading light. He showed them the barn, with its concrete floor and electric milking machines, the equipment shed housing a tractor, a combine harvester, a hay baler, and various other implements, all relatively modern, all well-maintained. He showed them the grain storage bins, the workshop with its array of tools, the chicken coop with its automatic feeders. Von Steinbach stopped in front of the tractor, a Farmel H that gleamed in the last rays of sunlight. He placed his hand on the hood, then turned to Thomas with an expression that struggled between disbelief and something that might have been envy. "You own all of this equipment yourself?" he asked. "Not the village? Not a cooperative?" "It's mine," Thomas said. "Bought it with bank loans, paid them off with good harvests. Most farmers around here have similar setups. Some have more, some less, depending on their acreage and what they grow." "And your land? You own this as well?" "Every acre. Bought it from my father, who bought it from his. We hold the deed free and clear." The 4 officers stood in a cluster, and Thomas could see them processing this information, comparing it against whatever framework they'd brought with them. In the Europe they knew, farmers were tenants or worked small plots. The landed gentry owned the estates, the equipment, the means of production. A farmer with 300 acres, modern equipment, a truck, a telephone, and a comfortable house was a contradiction to everything their experience had taught them. "I think," von Steinbach said slowly, "that we are beginning to understand why you won the war." The first week unfolded like a systematic dismantling of assumptions. Thomas worked them hard, not cruelly, but with the expectation that men who claimed agricultural expertise could handle farm labor. They rose at 5:30 to the sound of Margaret ringing the breakfast bell, a tradition that had called Brennan men to morning meals for 3 generations. The officers appeared promptly, and Thomas noted with approval that they'd brought work clothes, rough pants, simpler shirts, though they still wore their military boots. Breakfast was hearty. Eggs from their chickens, bacon, pancakes, coffee, orange juice. James chattered about his upcoming school play while Sarah read from her library book between bites, and Robert mostly kept silent, watching the Germans with an adolescent's suspicious intensity. His uncle had died at Normandy, and though Robert had been too young to fully understand the war when it happened, he understood loss. Captain Mueller noticed the boy's stare and met it levelly. Not hostile, but not apologizing either. Something passed between them, an acknowledgement, perhaps, that they were both carrying things they hadn't chosen to carry. The morning's work involved harvesting the last of the corn crop. Thomas drove the combine while the officers followed with the truck, learning to shovel the golden grain as it poured from the machine's hopper. It was hard, dusty work, and within an hour, their shirts were soaked with sweat despite the cool air. But they didn't complain. Thomas suspected they were proud men trying not to show weakness, and he respected them for it. During a water break, Lieutenant Weber asked about crop rotation, and Thomas explained the pattern he followed: corn, soybeans, oats, then hay, rotating through his fields on a 4-year cycle to maintain soil health. Weber nodded thoughtfully, and Thomas realized the man wasn't just making conversation. He was genuinely interested, filing away information. In Germany, Weber said, the estates used similar methods, but the decisions came from above, from the landowner or his administrator. The men who worked the soil did not think about why, only about what they were told to do. That seems inefficient, Thomas observed. Yes, Weber said quietly. We are learning that many things were inefficient. At midday, Margaret brought lunch to the field: sandwiches, cold fried chicken, thermoses of lemonade, cookies. The officers seemed genuinely surprised that she'd made the trip, that she'd gone to such effort. Major Reinhardt, who spoke the least of the four, said something in German to the others, and Mueller translated. He says your wife treats you like valued workers, not servants. She treats you like men, Thomas corrected. There's a difference. That afternoon, Thomas took them to visit his neighbor, George Henderson, who farmed a similar-sized spread 2 miles east. George was older, 63, and had fought in the First World War. Thomas had wondered how he'd react to German officers, but George surprised him by shaking their hands and launching immediately into a discussion of hybrid corn varieties. George's farm was even more impressive than Thomas's. He had 2 tractors, a newer truck, and had just installed electric lights in his barn. His house had been recently renovated, with new siding and a sunroom addition where his wife, Ellen, grew herbs year-round. Von Steinbach walked the property with the careful attention of a man trying to solve a puzzle. At one point he stopped and turned in a slow circle, taking in the fields, the buildings, the equipment. This is not possible, he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. What's not possible? George asked, his hearing sharper than his age suggested. Von Steinbach seemed to struggle for words. In Prussia, in Bavaria, in all of Germany, a holding like this would belong to a count, perhaps a baron. The agricultural wealth concentrated here, in the hands of one family, would require nobility. It would require title, inheritance, bloodlines. George laughed, not unkindly. Well, my bloodline includes a grandfather who was a cobbler in Ohio and a grandmother who was Irish and couldn't read. My title is Mr., and I inherited 40 acres and a mule from my father. The rest I built by working 16-hour days for 30 years and making more good decisions than bad ones. That evening, back at the Brennan farm, the officers sat on the porch as the sun set, drinking the beer Thomas had offered from the refrigerator. Another marvel they'd noted. The refrigerator was a Frigidaire electric, less than 5 years old. In it, Margaret kept milk, butter, eggs, leftovers, vegetables. The officers had seen her retrieve ice cubes from its freezer compartment that morning, casually, as if conjuring solid ice from a box in one's kitchen was the most natural thing in the world. We must ask you a question, von Steinbach said, setting down his beer with the gravity of a man broaching a difficult subject. And please understand, we do not ask to insult, but to understand. Are you wealthy, Mr. Brennan? Are you among the richest men in this region? Thomas considered the question, rocking slowly in his chair. Define wealthy, he said finally. My grandfather lived in a sod house when he homesteaded this land. My father built the first version of this house with timber he cut himself. I make a good living. I can pay my bills, save some, help my kids with college if they want to go. By American standards, I'm middle class. Comfortable but not rich. There are men in Des Moines who own banks and factories, they're wealthy. I'm just a farmer. Just a farmer, Mueller repeated softly. Mr. Brennan, in Europe what you have, the land, the equipment, the house, the truck, the education your children receive. This would require wealth beyond the dreams of a farmer. This would require being born into privilege, or marrying into it, or extraordinary luck. Yet you speak of it as if it is ordinary. It is ordinary, Thomas said. Drive through any county in Iowa, and you'll see 100 farms like mine. Some bigger, some smaller, but all owned by the families who work them. That's what this country was built on, The idea that a man who works hard can own land, can build something, can pass it to his children. No permission needed from some lord. No bowing to a title. Captain Mueller leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his expression intense. Do you understand what you are telling us? You are telling us that the average German soldier we captured, the boys we commanded, they were fighting to defend a system where they could never own what you have. They were told they fought for the fatherland, for honor, for soil and blood. But the soil belonged to others, and the blood was theirs to spill. While here, a farmer, a simple farmer, lives better than the junker lords we served under. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant lowing of cows settling for the night. Robert, who had been listening from the doorway, spoke for the first time to the officers. "My uncle died in France," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "My mother's brother. He was 22. Von Steinbach turned to look at the boy, and his face showed an exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness. "I am sorry," he said simply. "We are all sorry, though sorry changes nothing." The second week brought a shift in the atmosphere. The officers began asking more questions, increasingly pointed ones, as if they'd decided that politeness could be temporarily suspended in favor of understanding. Major Reinhardt, who had been mostly silent, revealed himself to be perhaps the sharpest observer of the four, with a background in agricultural economics that made his observations particularly cutting. Over breakfast on Monday, he asked Thomas about debt. "You mentioned bank loans," Reinhardt said, cutting his eggs with Prussian precision. "What are the terms? How much interest? What happens if you cannot pay?" Thomas pulled out a ledger he kept in the kitchen desk. Margaret managed the household accounts, but he tracked the farm finances. He showed Reinhardt the numbers. The loan for the combine, taken out at 6% interest over 5 years, already 2/3 paid off. The earlier loan for the tractor paid in full. The original mortgage on the additional 100 acres he'd purchased 8 years ago, now carried at a low rate with regular payments. "If I couldn't pay," Thomas explained, "the bank could foreclose, take the equipment or the land. But banks don't want farms, they want reliable customers. So they work with you if you hit a bad season. Give you extensions, adjust terms. They're invested in your success because your success is their success." Reinhardt studied the ledger as if it were a military intelligence document. "The interest rates are low," he observed. "In Germany, before the war, farmers paid double this, sometimes triple. And they had no recourse if the landowner decided to end their tenancy. They could farm the same plot for generations, but never own it." "That's not farming," Thomas said. "That's feudalism." "Yes," Reinhardt agreed quietly. "Yes, it is." That afternoon, Thomas drove them into Cedar Valley for supplies. The town was modest, population 3,000, but prosperous enough. Main Street had 2 banks, a hardware store, a pharmacy, a diner, a movie theater, several shops, a grain elevator, and the county agricultural office. Cars and trucks lined the streets. People greeted each other by name. At the hardware store, Thomas introduced the officers to Frank Morrison, the owner, who'd served in the Pacific Theater. Frank's initial coldness thawed when von Steinbach asked intelligent questions about a new type of fence post, and soon they were deep in discussion about material durability and soil conditions. When Thomas went to pay, he opened an account book where Frank recorded the purchase. "I'll settle with you end of the month," Thomas said. "Sounds good," Frank replied, making a notation. Outside, Lieutenant Weber stopped on the sidewalk. "He trusts you to pay later?" "We've done business for 20 years, Thomas said. "Trust goes both ways." They walked to the diner for coffee, and Thomas watched the officers take in the scene. Farmers and townspeople mixing easily, everyone dressed simply but cleanly, the conversations punctuated with laughter. A young couple in a corner booth shared a milkshake with 2 straws. An older man read a newspaper while his wife knitted. The waitress, a girl about Sarah's age, took orders with cheerful efficiency. "Inflation must be very low here," Mueller observed, studying the menu prices. "A meal costs little relative to what I assume is average income. Farm prices are good right now," Thomas acknowledged. War created demand, and Europe needs rebuilding. That helps us. But even in harder times, food stays relatively affordable. Government programs help stabilize prices. And there's enough competition that no one can gouge too much. Von Steinbach ordered coffee and pie, and when it arrived, he ate slowly, making it last. Thomas recognized the behavior, a man who had known hunger and remembered it. "Tell me about your education," von Steinbach said. "You speak well. You understand finance, agriculture science, economics. Yet you present yourself as a simple farmer." "I finished high school," Thomas said. "Read a lot. County Extension Office runs programs, brings in experts from the state university to teach new techniques. And I went to farmer conferences, learned from neighbors, tried things, failed at some, succeeded at others. That's how it works." "Your children," Reinhardt interjected. "They attend school in town?" "Every day. Public school, free through 12th grade. Robert wants to study engineering at Iowa State. Sarah's talking about becoming a teacher. James. Well, James is 8, so he mostly wants to catch frogs and avoid baths. And you can afford university tuition?" Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. We've been saving. There are scholarships available too, for good students. The GI Bill helps veterans, and there are state programs. It's not easy, but it's possible. In this country, education is seen as investment, not privilege. The conversation continued as they drove back, ranging across topics: healthcare, expensive but available, with charity hospitals for those who couldn't pay; electricity, the Rural Electrification Administration had brought power to most farms in the 30s; roads, maintained through fuel taxes and local bonds; social mobility, real, but not automatic; effort mattered, luck helped; discrimination existed, but was slowly being challenged. That evening, Margaret invited the officers to help with supper preparation. Not as servants, but as participants. She taught Mueller how to make proper biscuits, showed Weber her technique for canning, let Reinhardt help James gather eggs while explaining how she managed the chicken coop for year-round production. Von Steinbach she set to snapping green beans while she rolled pie dough. "In my family," he told her, working with the beans, "cooking was servant work. Proper people did not enter kitchens." "Proper people eat," Margaret replied, crimping the pie crust with practiced fingers. "Seems logical they should know how food happens. Besides, everyone in this house works. Children do chores because work teaches responsibility. Thomas and I share duties because marriage is partnership. And guests pitch in because that's what neighbors do." "You see us as neighbors?" Margaret paused, considering her words carefully. "I see you as men far from home, learning hard truths about the world they fought for. I see you as fathers and sons and brothers to people I'll never meet but who probably love you despite everything. That's neighbor enough for me." Von Steinbach's hands stilled on the beans. When he spoke again, his voice was rough. "My wife and daughter were in Berlin when the Russians came. I have not heard from them since. I do not know if they live." Margaret set down her rolling pin and placed a flour-dusted hand on his shoulder. "Then we'll hope," she said simply. "Until you know different, we'll hope." The third week brought harvest's end and the beginning of preparations for winter. Thomas taught them about soil management, crop rotation planning, equipment maintenance. They cleaned and repaired tools, reinforced fence lines, checked drainage ditches. Robert worked alongside them now, his initial hostility eroded by proximity and shared labor. He taught Weber how to repair a carburetor, showed Mueller where the best fishing spot was on the creek that bordered the property. One afternoon, Sarah came home from school excited about a project, studying different countries. She'd been assigned Germany, and hesitantly asked the officers if they'd help. They spent 2 hours at the kitchen table drawing maps, explaining geography, teaching her basic German phrases. Von Steinbach found a photo in his wallet, a small, creased image of a half-timbered house in Bavaria. "This is where I grew up," he said. "My father was estate manager for a count. We lived in this house because of his position. When he died, we had to leave. I joined the army because it provided security, a future. This is what I thought I was fighting to preserve. Sarah studied the photo with a child's unfiltered curiosity. It's pretty, she said, but our house is nicer. We have indoor bathrooms and heat in every room. Yes, von Steinbach said softly. Yes, you do. The turning point came during the 4th week, on an evening when Thomas built a fire in the hearth and brought out a bottle of whiskey he'd been saving. The work was caught up, the weather had turned properly cold, and there was a sense that time was running short. The officers would leave in 10 days. They sat in the living room, the fire crackling, the radio playing soft music, Margaret mending socks in her chair, while the children did homework at the dining table. It felt domestic, comfortable, and perhaps that comfort loosened tongues that military discipline and national pride had kept guarded. We must tell you something, von Steinbach began, setting down his glass with the air of a man approaching a confession. When we arrived here, we believed we were coming to a primitive place. We had heard of American industrial might, we experienced it on the battlefield, in the skies, on the seas. But we assumed this power came from factories in cities, from wealthy industrialists, from concentrated urban centers. We assumed the countryside would be backward, the farmers poor and ignorant. We assumed this because this is what we knew, what our world taught us to expect. Mueller picked up the thread. The first night, when we saw your house, your equipment, we thought perhaps you were an exception. A local wealthy man, perhaps someone with family money. Then we visited Mr. Henderson, and we saw the same prosperity. In town, we saw shops full of goods, people well-fed and well-clothed, automobiles everywhere. We began to understand that what you have is not exception but standard. And this understanding, Weber continued, his English improving with each passing day, it changes how we see everything we were told, everything we believed. We were taught that American farmers were simple, that they lived like European peasants. We were taught that only the socialist collective or the aristocratic estate could produce agricultural abundance. We were taught that individual ownership led to inefficiency, that strong central control was necessary. Yet here, Reinhardt finished, we find the opposite. Individual farmers owning their land, making their own decisions, using modern equipment they themselves purchase, and they produce more, live better, and create wealth that spreads through the community. The system we believed in, fought for, defended, it was built on lies we did not recognize as lies because we had nothing to compare them to. The room was quiet except for the fire and the ticking of the clock. Margaret had stopped mending, her hands still in her lap. The children had abandoned their homework pretense and were listening openly now. Thomas took a slow sip of whiskey, considering his response. That must be a hard thing to learn, he said finally. That what you risked your lives for was built on false promises. It is worse than hard, von Steinbach said. It is devastating, because we did not just risk our own lives, we took the lives of others. We followed orders that destroyed cities, killed civilians, enabled atrocities. At the time, we told ourselves it was duty, honor, necessity. We believed in the cause, or at least in the obligation to serve our country. But if the cause was built on lies, if the system we defended was fundamentally unjust, what does that make us? Human, Margaret said quietly, looking up from her lap. It makes you human. People believe what they're taught, especially when questioning brings punishment. You didn't have a democracy where debate is allowed, where people can criticize their government without disappearing in the night. You had something different, and by the time you understood what it truly was, you were trapped in it. That is generous of you, Mueller said. More generous than we deserve. Maybe, Margaret agreed, but holding on to anger and judgment, that's a weight I'm not interested in carrying. Doesn't mean there aren't consequences for what was done. Doesn't mean justice isn't necessary. But you 4 men, sitting in my living room, learning about corn yields and how to make biscuits. I don't think punishing you personally serves anything. Robert spoke up from the dining table, his young voice serious. But how do we know you mean it? How do we know you wouldn't do the same things again if you went back? It was a fair question, honest and direct, and the officers treated it with the respect it deserved. We cannot give you absolute certainty, von Steinbach said. turning to face the boy. "But I can tell you that what we have learned here has changed us fundamentally. When I return to Germany, if I can find my family, if I can rebuild any kind of life, I will remember this place. I will remember that a farmer named Thomas Brennan, who had every reason to hate us, showed us hospitality instead. I will remember his wife's kindness, his children's cautious trust. And I will remember that the American system, for all its flaws, allows ordinary people to build extraordinary lives through their own effort. The question," Reinhardt added thoughtfully, "is not whether we personally would do the same things again. The question is whether we can help ensure that Germany, as a nation, never does such things again. That we build something new on the ruins, something that values individual dignity, that distributes power and wealth, that allows farmers to own their land and workers to benefit from their labor." The conversation continued deep into the night, ranging across philosophy, politics, morality, and hope. The officers spoke of their childhoods, their families, their experiences in the war, not glorifying it but trying to explain how they had arrived at this moment, in this Iowa farmhouse, confronting the gap between what they believed and what they discovered. Thomas shared his own doubts about America, the treatment of Negroes in the South which shamed him, the exploitation of workers in some industries, the lingering inequality despite the opportunities that existed. "We're not perfect," he said. "Far from it. But the structure allows for improvement. People can organize, protest, vote for change. It's messy and slow, but it's real." When the clock struck midnight, Margaret stood and began ushering children to bed despite their protests. The officers helped clear glasses, bank the fire, prepare for the next day. As they moved through the evening rituals, von Steinbach paused at the base of the stairs. "Mr. Brennan, I must tell you something," he said. "When we board the train to leave, we will file reports with the program administrators. These reports will be read by officials in both countries, used to evaluate the success of this exchange. I intend to write truthfully about what we have seen and learned here. I intend to confess that we were wrong about America, about its farmers, about the relationship between freedom and prosperity. This may not be what some wish to hear, but it is what we owe you, the truth in exchange for the truth you have shown us." Thomas extended his hand, and von Steinbach shook it firmly. "That's all any of us can do," Thomas said. "Tell the truth and try to do right. Everything else is just details." The final days passed with a bittersweet quality, the way autumn itself feels when summer's warmth gives way to winter's promise. The officers had become part of the farm's rhythm, waking to Margaret's breakfast bell, working through morning chores, sharing meals at the long kitchen table where conversations ranged from practical matters to profound questions about how societies should organize themselves. On their last Saturday, Thomas organized a farewell dinner and invited the neighbors. George and Ellen Henderson came, bringing a basket of late-season apples from their orchard. Frank Morrison drove out from town with his wife, carrying a smoked ham from his brother's farm. Even the Methodist minister, Reverend Clayton, accepted the invitation, curious about the German officers he'd heard discussed at every church social for the past month. Margaret outdid herself with the meal: roasted chicken, the ham, mashed potatoes, 3 kinds of vegetables from her preserved stores, fresh rolls, 2 pies, and a cake she decorated with both American and German flags made from colored frosting. It was a bold gesture, that cake, and Thomas saw some of the guests pause when they spotted it. But Margaret set it on the table without apology, and the moment passed. The conversation around the dinner table was cautious at first, then gradually more open as people realized the officers were neither monsters nor heroes, but men not so different from their own sons and brothers who had served. George told stories about the Great War, drawing parallels and contrasts. Frank asked about German manufacturing techniques, genuinely interested in post-war rebuilding. Ellen discussed gardening methods with Mueller, who revealed that his mother had been an avid gardener and shared seeds with neighbors as a form of currency during hard times. Von Steinbach found himself seated next to Reverend Clayton, and their conversation turned philosophical. "What troubles you most?" the Reverend asked directly, his pastoral experience making him unafraid of difficult questions. "That we were so easily deceived," von Steinbach replied. "Or perhaps that we deceived ourselves. We saw the concentration camps being built and told ourselves they were necessary security measures. We heard the rhetoric against Jews, against Slavs, against any group labeled as other, and we told ourselves it was just politics, just words. We felt the system tightening around us and told ourselves it was temporary, that order was being restored. By the time we understood what we had enabled, the machinery was too large to stop. And now I have seen an alternative. Not perfect, as Mr. Brennan reminds us, but functional. A society where power is distributed, where ordinary people have genuine voice and opportunity, where the farmer is not subject to the Lord's whim. I must go home and help build something like this from the ruins. I do not know if it is possible. Germany is devastated, occupied, divided. But I must try. Reverend Clayton nodded slowly. Then you understand what repentance truly means. Not just feeling sorry, but turning around and walking a different direction. The walking is the hard part. After dinner, as evening settled over the farm, Robert asked the officers to help him with a school project he'd been postponing, building a model bridge for his engineering class. They spread out in the barn workshop, cutting balsa wood by lamplight, and discussing principles of weight distribution and structural integrity. It was Robert who finally voiced the question that had been hovering unspoken through the entire 2 months. When you were fighting, he said, carefully gluing a joint, did you think about the people you were fighting? Did you think about them having families and farms and regular lives? Weber answered, his hands stilling on the wood. Sometimes, yes. Mostly, no. In combat, you think about survival, about completing the mission, about protecting the men beside you. The enemy is abstract, a target, a threat. This is how soldiers must think to function. But afterwards, you think about it constantly. My uncle, Robert said, his voice catching slightly. I barely remember him. I was 6 when he left. I remember he used to let me ride on his shoulders. That's all. And my mom. She still cries sometimes when something reminds her of him. A song on the radio or someone laughing like he laughed. It doesn't go away. No, Weber agreed quietly. It does not go away. For any of us. They worked in silence for a while, the sounds of the barn, the cattle settling, the mice rustling in the hay, the wind against the walls, providing a backdrop to their shared understanding that some wounds remain, that acknowledgement is not the same as healing, but perhaps acknowledgement is where healing must begin. The final morning came too quickly. The officers packed their few belongings, made formal farewells to each family member. Margaret pressed wrapped packages of food into their hands, sandwiches for the journey, cookies, apples. Sarah gave them each a drawing she'd made of the farm, and James solemnly shook every hand and presented each officer with a smooth stone from his collection, chosen with the serious deliberation of a child who understands that gifts should mean something. In the truck on the way to the station, von Steinbach asked one last question. Mr. Brennan, I must know, do you think what we learned here can translate to Germany? Can a nation destroyed, occupied, full of people who have lost everything, rebuild itself on these principles of individual ownership and distributed power? Thomas drove in silence for a moment, watching the fields pass. I think people want the same things everywhere, he said finally. Security for their families, opportunity for their children, fair return for honest work. The dignity of owning something that can't be taken away on a whim. You've got the Marshall Plan money coming in, you've got allies willing to help rebuild instead of just punishing. And you've got men like you who've seen both systems and know which one serves people better. That's a start. But will it be enough? That depends on what you do with what you've learned. You can't just copy America, you're not America. You've got different history, different culture, different challenges. But the principles, property rights, rule of law, limited government power, opportunity based on merit rather than birth, those can work anywhere if people commit to them. The question is whether enough Germans are ready to try something genuinely new, or whether old habits and old hierarchies will reassert themselves. At the station, a small crowd had gathered. Word had spread that the German officers were leaving, and curiosity had drawn people. Some faces were friendly, others merely watchful. A few older women stood apart, their expressions hard. Thomas understood. They likely had sons or husbands who hadn't come home. As the officers stood on the platform waiting for the train, Captain Mueller pulled out a small notebook and approached Thomas. I kept notes, he explained, about everything we saw, everything we learned. Crop yields per acre, equipment costs and efficiency, land ownership patterns, educational access, infrastructure investment. I intend to publish these findings, perhaps as a series of articles or a book. Would you permit me to use your farm as a primary example? Use whatever helps, Thomas said. But tell the whole truth, the good and the difficult. Tell them about the bank loans that some farmers can't repay, about the families that lose their farms in bad years. Tell them about the discrimination, the advantages some people get that others don't. The system works better than what you had, but it's not perfect, and pretending otherwise doesn't serve anyone. I will tell the complete truth, Mueller promised. I think that is what we owe the world now. The complete truth, however uncomfortable. The train whistle sounded in the distance, and Major Reinhardt stepped forward. He had spoken the least during the entire stay, but now he seemed compelled to say something before departure. I was a professor before the war, he said. Agricultural economics at the University of Heidelberg. I taught that centralized planning was necessary for efficiency, that individual farmers were too ignorant to make optimal decisions, that the aristocratic estate system represented rational resource allocation. I built my career on these theories. Then I went to war, saw my country destroyed, and came here to find my life's work was fundamentally wrong. A farmer in Iowa understands soil chemistry better than I taught it. You make economic decisions with more sophistication than I credited. You have created a system that produces more, distributes wealth more fairly, and respects human dignity more genuinely than anything I advocated for. He paused, and Thomas could see him struggling with emotion. If I survive to teach again, I will spend the rest of my career trying to undo the damage my earlier teachings may have caused. This is my confession and my commitment. The train rounded the bend, its steel wheels screeching against the rails as it began to slow. Von Steinbach stood at attention and offered Thomas a formal salute. Not the Nazi salute that had been banned, but a simple military gesture of respect. Colonel, Thomas said, returning the gesture with a nod. I hope you find your family safe. I hope you find a Germany ready to rebuild on better foundations. And I hope you remember that forgiveness is possible, even when it seems impossible. Americans are practical people. We'd rather have a prosperous, democratic Germany as a partner than carry the burden of permanent enemies. We will remember, von Steinbach said. We will remember Cedar Valley, the Brennan Farm, and the lesson that freedom and prosperity are not opposing forces but complementary ones. We will remember that the richest men we met in America were those who would have been peasants in Europe, and that this was no accident but the result of deliberate choices about how to organize society. The train hissed to a stop, and the officers climbed aboard. Through the window, Thomas saw them take their seats, saw them look out at the small Iowa town one last time. As the train began to move, Weber raised his hand in farewell, and Thomas raised his in return. Margaret, who had driven separately with the children, stood beside him now. She slipped her hand into his, and they watched the train disappear into the distance, carrying 4 men back toward an uncertain future in a devastated homeland. Do you think it mattered? She asked quietly. 2 months with 4 men. Will it change anything? I don't know, Thomas admitted, but they'll go back and tell others what they saw. Some will listen, some won't. Maybe one of them writes that book Mueller mentioned, and it influences policy. Maybe Reinhardt teaches a new generation of economists different principles. Maybe von Steinbach finds his family and raises his daughter to understand that societies should serve people, not the other way around. Small things that compound over time, that's how real change happens. They drove home through the autumn landscape, past farms that looked unremarkable because their prosperity had become ordinary, past towns whose modest commercial activity represented a distribution of wealth unimaginable in feudal systems, past schools and churches and libraries that existed because communities had chosen to invest in shared goods rather than hoarding resources for the privileged few. 3 months after the officers departed, a letter arrived at the Brennan farm, forwarded through the Agricultural Exchange Program. It was from von Steinbach, written in precise English on thin paper that spoke of ongoing shortages in post-war Germany. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Brennan and family, I write to you from Frankfurt, where I have been reunited with my wife and daughter. They survived the war, though the story of their survival is one I cannot yet fully speak about. My daughter is 16 now, thin but recovering, and when I told her about Iowa, about your farm, about the life you live, she wept. Not from sadness, but from hope, the hope that such places exist, that such lives are possible. I have begun speaking to groups here about what we witnessed in America. At first, people did not believe me. They thought I was exaggerating, or that I had been shown propaganda, carefully staged scenes designed to impress. But Captain Mueller has published his first article with the detailed data, and Major Reinhardt has joined the advisory board helping to restructure agricultural policy in the American zone. The evidence accumulates. You should know that your country's Marshall Plan is offering loans and grants to help us rebuild. But more importantly, the American administrators are insisting on certain reforms as conditions for aid, land redistribution, breaking up the old estates, creating opportunities for ordinary farmers to own their land. It is radical change, opposed by those who benefited from the old system, but supported by those who have seen the alternative. Your farm, Mr. Brennan, has become something of a legend in certain circles here. The Iowa farmer who lived better than a baron. This is how you are described. Some resent this, feeling it diminishes German pride. But others, especially young people who want to build something new from the ruins, speak of you and others like you as proof that different choices lead to different outcomes. Please give my regards to Robert, Sarah, and James. Tell them that their small kindnesses, the drawings, the stones, the shared homework, mattered more than they can know. In a world that had shown us mostly cruelty, their simple human decency reminded us that another way of living was possible. With deepest gratitude, Friedrich von Steinbach. Margaret read the letter aloud at dinner, and when she finished, the family sat in silence for a moment. Then James, now 9 and less prone to childhood shyness, asked, "Are we going to write back?" James asked. Thomas looked at his youngest son, then at Margaret, then at the letter still trembling slightly in her hands. "Yes," he said, "we're going to write back." And they did. Not just once, but for years. The correspondence became a bridge spanning an ocean and two very different worlds struggling to understand each other. Von Steinbach wrote about the slow, painful reconstruction of Germany, the debates over land reform, the resistance from old guard aristocrats who saw their privileges disappearing, the young people who embraced democratic principles with the fervor of converts. He wrote about his daughter Anna attending university, studying political science, determined to help build a government that could never again concentrate power so dangerously. Mueller's articles evolved into a book, published in 1952, titled The Democratic Farm: What Germany Can Learn from American Agriculture. It became required reading in the new agricultural colleges being established across West Germany. Reinhardt, true to his word, spent the rest of his career teaching a revised economic theory that emphasized distributed ownership and individual initiative. Weber returned to his family's region and became an advocate for the small farmers receiving land under the reform programs. But perhaps the most profound impact was one that couldn't be measured in policy changes or academic papers. It was in the thousands of small conversations these four men had over the years, in beer halls and classrooms, at family dinners and political meetings, where they told the story of an Iowa farm where an ordinary man lived an extraordinary life simply because his society had been structured to allow it. "We thought we were fighting for homeland and honor," von Steinbach wrote in one letter, dated 1955. "But we were really fighting to preserve a system that kept most of our countrymen from ever owning their own homeland, from ever having honor beyond what their betters allowed them." Thomas Brennan's farm taught us that patriotism without justice is just tyranny with a flag. The Brennan children grew up with an unusual understanding of how fortunate they were. Robert did go to Iowa State, became an engineer, and eventually worked on rural electrification projects in developing countries. Sarah became a teacher, specializing in social studies, and always began her units on government with a simple question: why do some systems let ordinary people prosper while others don't? James, the youngest, eventually took over the family farm, modernizing it further while maintaining the values his parents had demonstrated. That prosperity carries responsibility, that hospitality is strength, not weakness, and that the measure of a society is how well the average person can live, not how grandly the elite can display their wealth. In 1963, now in his late 60s, von Steinbach made a return visit to Cedar Valley with his wife and daughter. Thomas was 57, his hair gray but his shoulders still broad, his hands still telling the story of a life spent working the land. They walked the farm together, and von Steinbach marveled at the changes. New equipment, expanded acreage, a renovated house with modern conveniences that would have seemed like science fiction 15 years earlier. But what struck him most was what hadn't changed. The fundamental dignity of the life, the direct connection between effort and reward, the simple fact that Thomas Brennan still owned this land, still made his own decisions, still prospered or struggled based on his choices and the weather and the market, not on the whims of distant powers or the privileges of birth. That evening, sitting once more on the Brennan porch, watching an Iowa sunset paint the sky in colors that seemed impossible, von Steinbach raised a glass of Thomas's whiskey in a toast. "To the ordinary miracle," he said, "the miracle of a free man on his own land, living well because his society allows it. May Germany achieve this miracle. May all nations achieve it. And may we never forget the cost of systems that deny it." "To ordinary miracles," Thomas echoed, and they drank together as the sun set over fields that had taught a colonel more than any battlefield ever could, that the true strength of a nation lies not in its capacity for war, but in its commitment to letting ordinary people build extraordinary lives. Subscribe to Forgotten Testimonies, where silence is never forgotten.